This is one thing that has not changed in 100 years. It's been the lead apron. You put it on, you go in and you do. So it's really time to make that change.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Murmur MD podcast here. We've got a special guest today. We've got Bob Foster, who's a practicing interventional cardiologist, also the co-founder and chief medical officer of Rampart IC. Bob, how you doing today, buddy?
Doing great. Appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to meet with us. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Before we get started, though, I just want to say, views and opinions expressed don't represent those of Murmur MD or Bob's Clinical Practice or Rampart necessarily, and we have no disclosures for this. So this is just a conversation with Bob Foster and myself about the dangers of radiation and occupational exposures, and this is particularly near and dear to my heart. As Bob knows, I've talked to him about this. I was recently diagnosed with intermediate stage prostate cancer at the age of 45. And as part of that process, I've really thought long and hard about the risks that I'm exposing myself to every day. I think you take for granted, everybody in fellowship and residency wants to be a team player. They want to work hard. They want to do a lot of cases. They want to be in the lab all the time. And once you get what you work so hard for, sometimes you question whether it was really worth it when you're faced with medical diagnoses like cancer. And one of the things that's interesting about my prostate cancer is that the actual genetic expression profiling showed that there was a high level of DNA damage. So it's hard to track one-to-one, but I can't imagine that the exposure I've had to radiation did in some part play that. But Bob, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your story and kind of how Rampart started. Can you give everybody just a quick overview, first of all, just what Rampart is for those that don't know, and then just kind of the background?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, congratulations on, I think, bringing this front and center and being honest about the issues that you have. So many people that in our profession are either, like you say, they're afraid to say my back hurts or I'm fatigued at the end of the day, or, I'm cognitively not quite as sharp because I'm tired, or, I've had cancer, or I've had, musculoskeletal injury like I have. So, kudos to you for kind of coming forward, because I do think that this resonates with so many people in our field. So Rampart is basically the word, before I get to the technology, the word comes from a barrier. It's a medieval term where the knights decided it better for them to get out of their armor and to create this barrier that protects the whole community, and then they can move around and function a lot better. And so that's where Rampart came from. It's basically, and it's Joe, it's really simple. I'm not that smart a man. It's really just taking the lead off of your back, putting it between you and the source. And the floor doesn't care and the ceiling doesn't care. So why not get it off our spines? We weren't designed to carry that much weight day in and day out. And no matter how strong you think you are, data shows that 60% of us are going to get injured. And so I tried to stay active and, was doing triathlons and everything that I possibly could. And despite that, kept rupturing discs in my back. And after the second disc rupture, I was sitting there and my leg was paralyzed. And it was a really dark time of how am I going to get, back to work? What is life going to be like going forward with, children, grandchildren, the things that I want to do when I eventually retire. And when I got back into the lab, there just weren't any real options. It was put back on the lead apron, and the neurosurgeon said, you just can't do that. It's already ruptured your disc twice. The next thing is going to be rods and everything else, and you'll really get back into a bad place. And so when we started looking for options, there just wasn't anything there. And so we got a lot smarter people than me to kind of put the idea together to say, if we take this off of our backs and put it between us and the source, and since weight doesn't matter at that point, why not go a full millimeter lead equivalency? And why, be satisfied with a half millimeter? Is half millimeter, okay? Yeah, it's okay if you're wearing it, if you don't have the spine issues. but it doesn't protect a lot of your body and doesn't protect your head and doesn't protect your arms. And it's got a big hole in the armhole, and most people's leads aren't fitting. And I know we'll get to that a little bit later, but there's a lot of things I think that are not sufficient for the job that we do, and we just keep going in there and doing it and rightly so. We've been so focused on patient care, and that's where my passion was. Love taking care of patients, and love, we have such a rewarding job that you can go in there and you can repair very sick vessels and really save lives, and we're blessed to do that, but we shouldn't have to do it our own apparel.
I totally agree. Did you get any radiation training or safety awareness, Bob, in your training or in your career?
No, not in the Cath lab. Now, obviously, you got a little bit nuclear medicine, when you did your nuclear boards and things like that, but nothing really in the lab. I really didn't get any formal training at all. And I was one of those, up to 50% of people who don't wear their badges because I was exceeding my numbers consistently because I did mostly peripheral work. So
yeah.
I was a peripheral guy and I kept exceeding it. So I just said, to heck with it, I'm gonna take it off. And a lot of us do, and we really shouldn't have to. So the amount of radiation I got, I really have no idea because I took my badge off, unfortunately.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think looking at the time I've spent in general cardiology fellowship and interventional fellowship, it was all about the cases. It was all about learning how to do the cases, the techniques. You never thought about the risks that you're exposing yourself to. And I think the real message with this podcast that we're doing today is I don't want our colleagues to wait until they get a cancer diagnosis like me or an occupational major injury, potentially career-ending injury like you had, to take this seriously, because I think the time is now. I think we need to really get it through our fellowship programs that this is something you need to be paying attention to, you need to be proactive about, because if you don't care about it, who else is going to care, right? And you see all these crises like the concussion crisis in football and the TBI crisis in the military, and it's the same exact thing that we've been doing. We've been putting ourselves in harm's way to save people's lives without any concern or thought of our own safety. So I applaud you, Bob, for doing that. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of dark year you had where you were out of the Cath lab? And Bill Lombardi talks about this a lot, how most interventional cardiologists' identity is so wrapped in what they do for a living. Like, what was that process like? I mean, did you have plans if you couldn't go back to the lab? What was going through your head during that long period of time?
My initial one was keep it simple and try to walk again. And so, if I could walk again, then maybe I could at least, go in the clinic and take care of patients. But when you put in all this effort and all this training, and you love going in there and being somebody who could just fix a vessel, and not being able to do that anymore. And for the first 2 years I was out of the lab, and so every time I found blockages, I'd have to give it to one of my partners to actually fix, and it was painful.
And then you're critiquing their case. You're looking at their PCIers like, how would I miss that maybe? Or
yeah. I mean, it's tough. And you're just, then I kind of worked my way back into maybe doing a diagnostic case here or there and not doing an intervention for a while. Then I limited my interventional cases to just one case or 2 cases a day, just to see how I did with that. And through that process is when we began to develop, there's got to be a solution out there. There's got to be a way that we can do this without putting on those lead aprons. And so, it was first pretty simple, but there was a lot of prayer going on, a lot of support from my colleagues, and even with my practice while I was out. And so, I think that was really a blessing. But I think but I wanted to get back to doing what I was doing, and I kind of felt like I was at the peak of my career. This doesn't hit you, when you're 65 or 70. It's getting us when we're in our 40s, and that's when we had the UAB fellows coming through, and we're training them how to do peripherals, and so we were doing some research. We were building an OBL. All these things that I really want to be involved in were just taken away, and it was it was a pretty tough time. But now in retrospect, you see that even through those tough times, I think you can look for opportunities where you can be used and useful. And I will say, quite selfishly, the design was to get me back in the lab. Could we design something to get me back in the lab? Because there was nothing out there. And then we started beginning to see this is an opportunity to help a lot more people than just me, and certainly a lot more subspecialties even. I'm obviously focused on cardiology, but then you get into vascular surgery, and you get into EP and structural and all these other subspecialties of cardiology, and that's leaving out even interventional GI and eventually hopefully orthopedics, and all of these subspecialties are exposing themselves day in and day out to those dangers of these DNA breaks that are happening. And so, I'd love to, when we kind of get to that point, talk about that a little bit, because I think those DNA breaks are something that we all fear. We hope that our body can repair them, but we don't really have great ways of measuring how good of repair, or if it's just, hits at the wrong spot at the wrong time, then it's going to turn into something bad. And we shouldn't have to, we shouldn't have to take that chance anymore.
I totally agree. In terms of the startup process, Bob, I think a lot of doctors have ideas like this. Your obviously motivation was extreme because you wanted to get back in the cath lab. Can you talk about that process? Because I think, they always say the best startups start with a really good unmet need, right? And I think you identified a really important unmet need. But what was that process like for you, going from building a device just to get you back in the lab to taking it a step farther with creating a startup around it and a product? Can you talk about that? Maybe some of the pain points you experienced, or lessons learned in that?
Absolutely. So it's a very risky thing. My motivation was, I think, significant that it would be able to get me back in the lab, and I think that would ultimately, if you will, pay me back for the investment, because it's a big investment up front. And Tom Livingston, he's an engineer and now CEO of the company, but he was the other co-founder that kind of helped guide me through the process. I'm like you, a scientist. You're a lot more entrepreneurial than I am or was back when I was your age. But there's a lot of ways that ideas can fail, and I do think that where the best ideas come from, the people who are in there doing this day in and day out. First, you have to, have a supportive family that's going to allow you to put forth the investment, and those early investments are obviously very risky. But I think that there was a lot that we didn't know going forward, which I'm kind of glad we were a little bit protected from that, because there's a lot of hurdles you have to go through with all of the IP and all the regulations and all the standards and all the FDA requirements. But I think you just take those head on one at a time, and as you do it, what I would say is that I think the two things that I would say probably is most important is to have some really good legal guidance that can guide you to the right way to set up the company, and the right way to certainly have some really good lawyers on the IP side as well, because if you have a good idea, you should be able to protect it, and that's really the one of the things that I think is really important to having a successful company, be able to and a successful idea is to have that. And then it's establishing up front how much are you willing to put into this and invest in this, and then whatever it takes above that, then go and raise the money to be able to do it, and at least get you to a point where you can be a successful business, or you just continue to do the raises. But I think the most exciting thing is the number of people that you get to meet, and all along the way you're meeting people like even me sitting in front of you. I'm not sure our paths would have ever crossed, but now I had just a great opportunity to meet some really neat and really, I think, people in this world that I think are going to make a difference.
I love it. Now, do you guys have a patent on the radiation protection? Is that where you started?
We do. Okay. We have a patent on it, and it's really the design. And so that's what you have to do, I guess, with any idea, is really, do a deep dive into what's out there already. Can you get a patent, or are you going to infringe on somebody else's patent? Because I do think that that's an important. You don't want to go all the way down the road and then realize somebody, will kind of come after you. But there are, really good patent lawyers that can, see the uniqueness of your design and why maybe other designs have failed or have not ever made it commercially, and some of the unique things about your design that would allow that to be successful, that would bring to market something that's never been brought to market before.
I love it. So let's get into kind of the risks, right? Because I think a lot of people, this data comes out. I know Sky recently had a new survey, but if we just look at the risks that we're exposing ourselves to day in, day out, you look at, we're 3 to 6 times more common to get cataracts. We've got an increased risk of left-sided brain tumors, hematologic malignancies, solid tumors. We know that low-dose radiation is atherogenic. And then we talk about women, right? There's a lot of women that are told to get out of the cath lab when they're pregnant, or discouraged from being in the cath lab.
Right.
And 2/3 of people have chronic musculoskeletal pain, to your point earlier. And then 10 to 15% of people need surgery. So, and I think it's one of those silent epidemics that you touched on, Bob, in terms of people aren't talking about this. Like we need to come out and announce that my back hurts, or, I had prostate cancer, or I had a lumbar surgery. Like, can you talk a little bit about how we can do that? How do we get people to come out and say, this is a problem, I'm having problems with this? Like, what has been your exposure? You've probably talked to a lot of people in your experience with Rampart. Can you talk a little about some of the stories you've heard and how we can get people to really come out and talk about this more openly?
Yeah. I think that I was amazed, Joe, that the survey was done in 2004 through Sky. It was done again in 2014, and then here again in 2025. And the numbers are getting worse. That there has not been one change in 20 years, even though we've known about it for 20 years. Why wasn't the change started back then that would have maybe helped me? And we are so innovative in cardiology, and yet this is one thing that has not changed in 100 years. It's been the lead apron. You put it on, you go in and you do your work. So it's really time to make that change. I think the biggest hurdle, and this was even in the Sky paper, that the biggest hurdles are administration and funding. And they're not the ones that are in there. So, we don't have, as cardiologists, as subspecialists, as vascular surgeons, a very good coalition of people saying, I either have to have the best protection or I'm going to walk away. And that's almost what we need to be at that point, because we care about our patients. We know patients will suffer, and we don't want that hanging over our head, so we stay silent. And that's not the right thing. I mean, to be honest, we had Rampart in 2019, and it was ready to go commercial. And of course, I wanted to have one, and so I went to my administrator and asked her to put on my lead apron. And that's how I got mine. I mean, I'm not sure I would have gotten it otherwise, but I asked her to put it on. I said, you put on this lead apron and you'll see what we're wearing day in and day out. And she was like, wow, that's really heavy. And then she, tried to hand it back to me. And I'm like, no, just wear it for 2 hours. I mean, you don't have to wear it long. Wear it just for 2 hours, and I'll come back and check on you. She was like, yeah, I can't wear that for 2 hours. It's too heavy. And you're like, but they're the decision makers. They're the ones deciding on this. And we don't have, I think, very good oversight. And I would say that we don't really have we don't have the push to say the mandates that this should change. And up until now, I really haven't had any choices. But now we've got choices. There are multiple companies out there. It's not just ours, but there are multiple companies out there that I think can drastically reduce your radiation risk. And I think that's where we are. That's to me the current technology is not sufficient. There are now solutions, and I think that needs to be mandated. And I think the Sky position paper, it's multi-society. It's going to come out in a couple months, and I think that's really going to be helpful and very powerful, because it's going to mandate change. that we have to make these changes in our labs. If you're going to create radiation, you need to protect us from it with the best technologies that are available.
I totally agree. And I think, I think that's one of the things I wanted to take home today for our listeners is, strategies you can utilize to convince your administrators. And so I think your point of having them wear your lead is fantastic, because people don't really get your perspective until they're forced to actually wear that lead. The other things I think have been helpful for me, so the first thing I did when I got my diagnosis was, I went into my CEO's office and I talked to him about getting Rampart. And, some of the compelling points you can make. Number one, it's really easy to take a survey. Mm-hmm. So I went to everybody in my Cath lab, I went to all my colleagues that were wearing lead, and I asked them, have you ever had orthopedic injury as a result of wearing lead all day? Do you have a bad back? Have you ever had surgery? Have you ever had a solid tumor cancer? And I was shocked that, probably over 50%, just like the data shows, have had some sort of chronic musculoskeletal issue. And so I think that's compelling when you come to your administrators and you say, hey, look, these are the people that work at your hospital that, that you're in charge of, and they're all hurting, right, from this lead exposure. I do think it's important to leverage your foundations. I think it's that's how we got Rampart for our hospital. Was I went to the foundation meeting, our philanthropic kind of event every year, and said, hey, why don't you guys wear this lead, just like you did with your administrators? And they wore it, and they're like, when can we give you this? Like, we want to make sure you guys are safe. And I think they want to do the right thing. They just need to be steered in the right direction. Yeah. And then can you talk a little bit about the data in terms of how it's actually cost beneficial if you look at the radiation reduction, Bob? Because I think that's compelling too, and people could use that to their advantage.
Yeah, I think the important thing is if you look at and we've kind of run the numbers before, if you look at from all the SKY data that came out from these 3 papers, basically, that you had physicians saying they'd work 10 years longer. You have a number of physicians that have already decreased the number of cases in their lab to protect their back because of fatigue. You've had physicians who have had to take time off because of back injuries in the last year. If you put that data together and you didn't have those things, people were able to keep their caseloads, that they were able to not take the time off, that they were able to even continue to work longer, then the ROI on this is less than 40 days. I mean, it's extremely, extremely small. The biggest thing that to me, what has motivated a lot of the hospitals now is like yourself. It's high volume people who are getting injured. And so, we had a call last week of a hospital system that's going to get some Ramparts, and their driving force was 2 of their physicians just got cancer and had to step away from the lab, and both of them in their 60s, one 6 months away from retirement, one year away from retirement. And now they're going into retirement with cancer. And that's what's making the change. And what we need is to make the change earlier. What we need is to protect those who haven't gone through this. And we're not getting I don't think the women into our subspecialties. We're not getting, I think a lot of people aren't going into this because of work-life balance and also the risk. Why not choose another subspecialty that doesn't have that? And so we're missing a lot of great talent. I think, the numbers show that I think there's 4% of women going into interventional cardiology. And because they're worried about it, their frames are smaller, and they're worried about the reproductive risks. And I think we're missing a lot of great talent. If your lab's like my lab, most of the nurses and techs are women, and they're wearing their lead every day. I mean, I was in the lab 3 days a week, and they're in there every day and wearing that lead every day. And very few of them are over 40. Most of them because of the either injury or just tired of being worn down by it, leave and go do something else. So we're losing some of our best talent, and the complexity of the procedures that we're doing now. You need extremely advanced teams to really have good outcomes, and we're losing them. So we're losing. I think you can make a compelling argument that not only can you recruit, but you can also retain the people that you have, and you'll have your physicians will be able to maintain their volumes. And as the numbers in the lab and what we're doing is getting more complex and higher volume, and we ought to be able to stay in there and do those procedures, and you just can't sustain it. And unfortunately, it knocks you out in your 40s, and then by the time you hit your mid 50s, then you're either just having your surgery to try to go longer, or you have some other pain that you just have to live with, and it just shouldn't be that way.
I totally agree. I mean, I think you look at the average interventional cardiologist brings in $5 million of revenue for the hospital, and you look at the impact that injuries and cancer can have on that, it's profound. And not to mention, most large health systems are usually self-insured, so you're kind of paying for that yourself too. And I think there was some data I came across that was really compelling. We'll put in the show notes, but for every per person millisievert you save with Rampart, it's like $61. And so for a 40-person cath lab, that's $136,000 you'll save just with that, just from the radiation exposure. So I think it's compelling, and it's helpful to have that type of data when you come to your administrators and try to convince them to do this. So
right.
I love that.
Data it's kind of older data. A lot of it's from the economics impact paper that was written by Mike Seymour. It's available on the ORSIF website, so if anybody wants to go to ORSIF, it's a nonprofit organization a not-for-profit organization on radiation protection. It's a great little site to get information, educational platform. But that economic paper, we're looking now into updating it, because I think it was written back in 2018 or so, and so getting a more updated version, I think that is important. The other thing that we're doing, Joe, is we're putting together a toolkit. We're doing it, ORSIF is doing it in conjunction with SCI, and putting together a toolkit for people to take their administration to say, here's the data, here's why this is so important. And I think we're seeing more and more hospital systems being very proactive to say, I want to go forward as we build out labs. We want them to have the newest and the best going forward. So we're seeing the needle move a little bit, but again, it's requiring a lot of fighting to get that done. And as you know, physicians just don't have time, or they may be passionate about it for a very short period of time, but then they're put on this long road of committees that has to go through the hospital, and they lose interest until they have an injury again, and then it starts all over, and we shouldn't have to take the time for it. It should be provided for us.
I think this is, in hindsight, starting a new job out of fellowship, this is like the first thing you should address, right? Mm-hmm. Before you ask for the fancy toys and the new structural equipment and new imaging stuff, you got to take care of yourself first. It's like, put your oxygen mask on first, then put it on so I think that's an important point. Now, we've talked about this a little bit, Bob. Have you guys, OSHA is kind of an overseeing body looking at the occupational risks of all sorts of workers, but healthcare workers are included in that. And OSHA is obligated to make sure employers are providing their employees with protective equipment, and radiation falls under that. Do you think not providing a radiation protection platform that reduces 99.7% of ionizing radiation, do you think that is an OSHA violation? Because I almost thought about going down this road before we got Rampart. Is that something? Have you heard of that? Has anyone done that? What are your thoughts on that? I know it's a little controversial, but
it is controversial, and it's complex because there's not a very clear path. OSHA has been, they are really an overseer of occupational health and occupational safety. But when it comes to radiation, a lot of times that's delegated to the states, and the states delegated individual radiation safety officers within the hospitals, which have varying degree of compliance. And so I think what we have to do, even as an organization, and one of the things that SCI is doing is kind of putting together this coalition of how do we help to organize the oversight of this. And, is it through OSHA? Is it at the state level? And that really hasn't been answered. I think we're right now in the throes of it because, it's been so easy, and there has not been much oversight. I know in my particular hospital, in 26 years, I never met my radiation safety officer. Yeah, they should have come up to me and say, you're one of the highest volume guys in Alabama, and yet your radiation numbers are 0. Why is that? And it's because it was on the shelf. But I never saw him, never heard from him. And our under table lead was in shams, and our abdominal shielding was gone. It had been missing for years, and so things weren't getting replaced because there wasn't any oversight like there should be. So I think now people are wising up to it, that we've got to get people protected, and it's not a condition that we should continue with now and it shouldn't have happened back then, but now we've got these new technologies. We've got ways that we can better protect you, and I will say not all of them are for every procedure. There are some procedures that for instance, Rampart doesn't work well for. But even in the procedures that it doesn't, and you're wearing lead aprons, make sure if you're in procedures that require a lot of radiation, you need to be in the 0.5 millimeter lead. It needs to be fitted lead. It needs to fit you. You shouldn't just have to borrow somebody's. I went back to my lab not long ago, and there were still 3 aprons walking around with my name on them because they just get transferred to the next person who walks by, and so they're clearly not fitted for them. So I do think it's important. There's a lot of different ways that you can reduce your radiation exposure, and all those need to be done in conjunction with advanced technologies, but things that you can even do now that we need to educate people on.
Well, let's focus on those. I think that's important. So even if you can't get Rampart, if you just look at first principles, I mean, the procedures we're doing are getting longer, right? Especially CTO operators, peripheral operators, structural operators. And so, I never learned a lot of this in fellowship, but can you talk a little bit about some of the best practices in terms of how to protect yourself when you're doing cases? And you talked a little bit about lead. I think that's super important. Make sure your lead fits. If you haven't gotten new lead in 10 years, that was the first thing I did when I got my diagnosis, was I got brand new lead, in the wait for Rampart. I got new lead glasses, at least, 0.25 millimeters of lead. What are the other big best practices you think for reducing radiation exposure?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, and I do, kudos to some of the C-arm companies and the big iron companies, because they are really advancing this and lower our radiation exposure with some of the new technologies. The problem is a lot of these labs aren't getting updated with some of the newer ones, because they are so expensive. The first thing that I would say is look at the type of procedures that you're doing and the type of lead that you're wearing if you're wearing lead. Keep in mind that the 0.5 millimeter lead equivalency is really what you should consider the safe lead, if you would, as far as blocking radiation. The 0.5 millimeter, but 0.5 millimeter is heavy, and if you go down to the 0.25 or even something less than that, then even the 0.5, you're getting about 96% attenuation in the part that it's covered. If you use the 0.5 millimeter, a lot of times it's only a 0.5 millimeter at the overlap zone, so the rest of it's 0.25. And as you know, most of the time we're standing there and scatter radiation's coming from our side, and that area is only 0.25, so you may be only getting 70 or 80% attenuation in that area, so you're not getting that much protection. So look at the procedures that you're doing, for one. Two, it's very important to have good under table lead and abdominal shielding. Most of your scatter radiation comes at the table level. So you don't want it just hanging off the table, because what's happening is radiation is hitting your patient and then hitting you. And so you really need to have your protection or some barrier between you and the patient's body, and that's where those abdominal shielding comes. And most of the systems actually come with abdominal shielding. The problem is that you take them on, take them off, and they eventually get lost. So then you never see them again. So
you're talking about RadPad? Is that the?
Yeah, I'm talking about the abdominal shielding that kind of comes up from
through
the rails that comes up.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
And there's some really good innovative abdominal shielding. The ones that Rampart makes, it's called a bunker. It's got 1 millimeter lead equivalent at the abdominal level, because that's where most of the radiation is coming from. So why not put a millimeter there, right? So it's a millimeter there. It needs to go all the way down to the floor. Then you start looking at what can you do from just a functional standpoint. Number one, everybody knows time, distance, and shielding. So you want to be as far away as you can from the radiation if possible. But we're limited by our arms and where we are ergonomically and where we stand. But if you can, then step away for your cine runs and things like that if you can. And then obviously table height. It's amazing how much reduction in radiation you can get if you just raise the table up an inch. So you want the table up as high as you're comfortable with, because that makes a difference. If it's lower, whenever the radiation hits the table, that's when you get your scatter. And so the closer it is to the source, the more scatter you're going to get in the room. So the higher it is, then the more will penetrate the table, more will go through to your II, and that's what you want. And then I'd say the last thing, I mean, we know collimation when you can, fluoro save when you can, try to stay off of Cine, lower your frame rates, and then lastly, it's stay out of those steep angles. And the steep angles is what really drives up a lot of the radiation. We're doing, obviously we do a lot of testing with Rampart, and when you start doing angulation, it makes a big difference. So stay out of steep angles if you can, particularly the LAO caudal and RAO caudal and cranial.
And what do you think about the live dosimetry type stuff like RaySafe? Is that, I think for me, I had that in my last job, and I think, they say if it's not measured, it's not managed. So I think it is really helpful to kind of get that kind of live feedback. Do you guys, are you a fan of that?
I think it is too, and I think certainly when you're using one of these advanced technologies, it's very important that you know how much radiation you're actually getting. The thing that we found though is that people have no idea what those numbers mean because they've never seen them before. So you put a badge on somebody, a real-time dosimetry badge behind a Rampart, and we on average get about 0.1 or 0.2 millirems per case. That's typically out of all the randomized trials that we've done, the real world data, that's about what you get is about 0.1 to 0.2. And a lot of times you'll get zeros. And it's not that you're getting zero radiation. It just means it's below that 0.1 millirem detection. But putting that into perspective, you can get 5,000 millirems. That's kind of what the number is of your limit per year. And if you're getting 0.1 millirem, then you can do 50,000 cases. I mean, it's really crazy how much you can get. But that's background. That's basically background radiation. So I think real-time dosimetry is very important when you're using the new technology because you are, in my opinion, you're just kind of trying to understand that you're now in charge of everyone's radiation protection. It used to be everybody just put on their lead and they were in charge of their own. Well, now with this protective shadow, you're in charge of everybody. So you want to make sure it's set up right and look at your numbers. And we've got some really good data. Christina Shin, she was a fellow now attending at Scripps and kind of looked at all of her cases over 6 months after getting Rampart, and her radiation numbers declined over that period, and yet her radiation usage went up. So she was doing more complicated cases, but her numbers went down. So over time, you can actually adapt and get better. So I think that's one of the things that it does. It gives you some kind of that behavioral change. That you can step back, and I think that's where things are going. I think people are going to start to evolve in the real-time dosimetry, and now they have real-time dosimetry that can be a dose of record too. So you don't have to wear your regular Landauer badge. You can just wear this, and it gives you a number on your phone every time that you do a case. You can see what numbers you get at the end of the day, and I think it allows that behavioral modification that you say, I'm going to try this, or I'm going to stay out of those steep angles, or it just makes you more conscious of what you're getting.
Totally, it's like a smartwatch, right? You can track your steps, you can see how your workouts are going. I think I got this Oura ring not too long ago as part of my getting healthy type kick that I've been on, and it's remarkable how bad my sleep can be, especially when I'm on call. Right. So I think for everything, I think it's important to know, are you getting enough sleep? Are you exercising? All that stuff. So I think
why not know what your risks are in the lab? I mean, that's where we live, that's where we work, and we should know that. I mean, I wear a Whoop, so I like to know my data, and I like to know how well I sleep, and I like to know things that I can modify to make that better. And I think people need to know that. For sure, kind of going forward, and I think we'll see that as probably one of the recommendations that come out of the Sky consensus paper is wearing real-time dosimetry.
I've had a lot of friends ask me since my diagnosis that we're all subjecting ourselves or have subjected ourselves to ionizing radiation. I mean, do you think that as interventional cardiologists who have that risk factor that we should be more aggressive about cancer screening? Because I think that's a question I get a lot. They don't even recommend getting your PSA checked until the age of 45 or 50. And so, I wasn't even gonna check mine. I got it checked because I was getting my testosterone levels checked. Like all my friends are on testosterone. So I'm like, I'll get my testosterone checked. And the PSA was high, and that's how I found my diagnosis. But do you think that we should be, obviously standard cancer screening is important, but do you think it's warranted maybe to be a little bit more aggressive about, staying healthy and getting your cancer screened, given the risks we're exposing ourselves to?
I think that's a great question, and I will say that, and I'll put in a pitch for SERP. SERP is the Symposium on Interventional Radiation Protection that is going to be the first international conference on radiation protection that's happening in September. So if you want to go to, just look at HMP is doing it, and I'm co-moderating that with Bella Housen. She's an interventional radiologist and vascular surgeon out of the UK. We've got some real experts in DNA damage and cancer, and I think that'd be a great question to ask them. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it'd be protective, but I do think that if there are some markers, and that's one of the things I think that we're seeing more is there are some markers now for DNA damage, and maybe even if we could test your ability to repair, or if there are now some tablets like Halo that have a combination of different type of more vitamins and herbs that we know enhance the repair of DNA. That should we be taking those if we know we're going into a long case? I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did, but certainly we ought to make sure that we're cognizant of our risks. And no one gets more radiation than we do as interventional cardiologists and interventional radiologists. We're by far the occupation that gets the most radiation. And and
unless you're working the night shift at Chernobyl,
we just felt secure with that lead apron on and go, well, it's not going to hurt me, but it does. And I've had quite a few friends pass away with cancer, and it's just devastating. It really is.
Yeah, and another plug that we had talked about is that the documentary Scatter Denial. I think that I watched that before all this, and I took it seriously, but I didn't do anything about it. But I think now, looking at that, it's a great way to educate yourself and learn about some of the things you can do to reduce radiation protection. So it's on YouTube, I think, right? So you can just kind of Google
it. On YouTube,
you
go scatterdenial.com. The next episode's actually about to come out. It's a 1 hour PBS version, but there's also I think a 2.5 hour with the first, if you want to watch the full 6 episodes. But it really goes through the history of radiation, and you get to talk to a lot of the peers that everybody who watches it will recognize that have suffered injury. And looking back to now really taking this on as kind of, I want this next generation to be better off than we are. And I think that's kind of where we are, is, something we now have solutions, we now have opportunity for prevention, and don't wait until it's too late. But it's a great, it really was a great documentary, and actually it's just nominated for an Emmy. So we'll see if it gets an Emmy. Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's where it starts, man. Is just awareness. I think that's the most important thing, like we're doing today. So let's get into Rampart. So tell me a little bit about the data. I know you guys have some large bodies of data on the actual percentage of radiation reduction you get with Rampart. So can you talk a little bit about the different systems you have in terms of the floor-based one and the ceiling-based one, and then what kind of radiation protection they offer? And then we'll get into some of the nuances, I think.
Absolutely. So it is an acrylic panel that has radiation attenuating material in it. It actually doesn't have lead in it. It actually has a bismuth. It's a biacrylic. And so it's 1 millimeter lead equivalency. So it's like, taking 2 lead aprons and putting between you and the source and putting that over the table. Has soft shielding that goes down to the patient. And the initial version which is still available, is the mobile version. So you can move it. You can move it room to room. It's basically these panels are on a mast that comes up beside you, goes over the patient, and they go up and down on electronic actuators. So that one's called the Defender. And we really felt like we had to go to a mobile version first, only because if we were to go into these places and say, hey, listen, this is an opportunity for you to get out of your lead, but we got to get in your ceiling and attach it to a ceiling somehow, it's not going to work. They're not going to allow us to go in and destroy the room to test something. So you really needed a mobile version. That's what we had. And it does very well if your access point is the groin or pedal approach or radial, and you're working up, in the chest or abdomen or head. It does have a mast that's really right there beside you. It doesn't really interfere. You do have to drape it. The draping takes about a minute. And so you put the drapes on. It's basically just three little drapes that go on it. And so, I used it for STEMIs and everything. You can use it for even rapid cases. And
that was one of my questions. So for STEMIs, you still recommend people use it?
I do. The only time that it really affects your workflow is if you have to move it room to room, because the actuators are relatively slow. So you'd have to bring it all the way down, put it in the transport position, take it to the other room, open it back up, raise it back up and drape it, and so that would be something that would take 10 minutes or so. But I kept mine in my room and just had it there, and it doesn't get in the way if a patient codes or arrests or anything like that. We always tell people, know where your lead is, just in case for whatever reason you need to move it out of the way to resuscitate a patient. You can put on your lead apron, but unfortunately it's happened to me several times where a patient arrests and I didn't have to move it out of the way. You could still do chest compressions. You could still, anesthesia could come in and do whatever they need to do, and you could continue working. But it is a millimeter lead equivalency. So as expected, it would be better than your lead apron, because especially in the head level, because we don't get much protection on our head and eyes with a lead apron. So all of our data is comparing it to the head shield in the correct position, which most of the time it's not. Most of the time we're just holding our remote control over here. But we really try to maximize. We did it with angles. We even put soft tissue, soft shielding over the II to really ramp up the KEV, to maximize the KEV that's generated in the system, and tested that. And again, the numbers are not pretty consistently 99.7 in two randomized trials. One was out of Emory, one was out of Australia. And then whenever we go in and take the Rampart in, we always badge everybody in the room, and we have a control badge that's kind of equidistant to the source to say this is what you would have gotten had you
that's great.
not had any protection. So you can say what the relative number is in reduction, and so that 99.7 is typically what we get, and that's really for everybody in the room. And you get to the end of the table, it's near 100% down there most consistently, and then 99.8, and then 997 for operator one. And that's real world cases. So that's structural, peripheral, EP, that's everything all combined. And a majority of these are in, we have hundreds of these now across the world, and a majority are in universities and very high volume places. So they're doing a lot of CTOs and a lot of complex cases. So these aren't just, quick diagnostic cases. These are very complex cases. So again, you get the 99.7. One of the limitations, though, of the Defender is that you have this mast here. So if you start going into like a really steep or need a really steep LAO cranie, then the C-arm comes up and can interact with that mast. So then you have to pull it toward you about 4 inches, and you have to move it around a little bit if you go to those real steep angles. And we'll tell people that that's your signal to try to stay out of those steep angles if you can, but obviously you can't avoid it in a lot of cases. In addition, although I was able to do all my peripheral cases with the Defender, I had to modify some things. I had to use longer sheaths, and so I could still get access to the groin but still see the leg. And so, there were some changes that I had to make. And so that's where the Guardian came out. The Guardian has 3 panels on it so that it can actually just go over the patient. Just imagine a head shield on steroids. That's really what it is. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple idea, but it's able to hinge around the sides of the patient. And if you put the bunkers on both sides of the table, then the opposite side is protected, and the operator side's protected. So you're really kind of cleaving off almost half the room now that can get out of lead. So for AAAs and things like that, where you have an operator on that opposite side, or you want to go left to right, up and over for a peripheral, then the nice thing about the Guardian is it can go over the patient and you can just isolate that leg. So with the Defender you can't. You have a panel that kind of goes straight across, and so you can't just isolate a leg without this portion kind of getting in your way. So the only cases that I was doing putting on my lead apron for was the TCARs. So anytime you're kind of working right up underneath the camera, then these barrier technologies struggle a little bit. So then you need your lead apron for those. But I would only do a couple of those per month. So the rest of the time I was out of lead. And the refreshing thing is, Joe, when you're doing these cases and you've worked all day and you haven't put your lead on, it's like, wow, this is just night and day. It really is refreshing to walk in and not wear lead all day long and walk back out and be able to move and initially you felt like you didn't have any clothes on. Lombardi calls it naked PCI because it's a weird feeling. But then if I had to go in, and we had a Defender in one of the rooms, and if my partner called me in there to help him out with the PCI, and I had to put my lead on, then I started getting kind of sensitive that, like, wow, my head's not being protected, my arms aren't being protected.
Yeah. And
so then it becomes opposite, that with the lead on you don't feel like you're protected. So, but it's getting over that hurdle that I always tell people. I think if these barrier technologies had come out first, and then somebody came out with the idea, hey, now let's get away from this. Let's put lead aprons on everybody. And yeah, it doesn't protect your head. Yeah, it's got a hole in the sleeve. And yeah, it weighs 25 pounds. Get over it. Nobody would ever go that direction.
Yeah. It's funny, people are,
100 years old.
Weighted vests are like all the rage now to work out in, like rucking and stuff like that. So it's like the opposite. You feel like you were rucking for a while, and now you're running without it. So I love that.
Right.
So STEMIs, you still use it. And so steep angles, can you talk a little about that? So how steep are we talking about? Are we like 30-30?
I had a Phillips system, and I would interact when I got more than about 30-30.
Okay.
And if I went steeper than a 30-30 LAO cranny, it doesn't interact with any other view. So the caudals.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So REO caudal, which is a common view for structural. Not a problem. That's great.
It's really just that LAO cranny, because it comes up toward the mass. The mass, the only time it interacts. If you go like super steep caudal, then these panels are free floating. So what they do is it can just drift, and it has a handle on it.
Oh, that's great.
So then you just pull it toward you a little bit, so you don't have to move the mast. So you just pull it toward you. So
got it. I don't like LAO cranial anyway, so it's my least favorite view, unless you're doing a diag.
Just stay out of that view anyway, because the amount of radiation you get in that LAO cranny is really high. Now I will say that as far as other products that we have, I do think it's important to protect everybody in the room, and we're protecting them a level that can get you out of the lead aprons, and that's what our company was founded on, and that's what we're trying to do. So now we have the Sentry, which is kind of a mobile shield that kind of goes in front of you, really easy to move around. The shield kind of comes up and down, and so for interventional echo, for anesthesia, for a lot of places we see the nurse just kind of puts that between her and her station, and she can just kind of use that to kind of move around as much as she wants as well. So I think that's something that I think is important, is try to get as many people out of lead as possible. And I think you see some companies that say, oh, we can protect you, but it's apples to oranges. Trying to get people out of lead aprons is a whole nother level of complexity. And I think what's important is you really have to make sure that you've got the data, not only the data to show them, but just say, hey, listen, we're going to put this real-time dosimetry badge on you. I'm going to show you what you get.
Yeah, I love that. And you guys do that the first week of implementation, right?
First week of implementation, then we go back
that.
2 weeks later, and then go back a month later, and go back 3 months later, and go back 6 months later. So we have these continuing educations where we'll train more people, we'll rebadge everybody again. And that's the data that we collect with the clinical trial that got published in AJC. It was 1,700 cases and 600 operators and 300 or 400 different sites. And so it's not just a single site. It's not a phantom. These are real world data. So and that's what you ought to expect is those numbers. And if you're not getting those numbers, then we want to look at it. And I do think we've kind of, to some degree, the numbers are so good that when somebody, if they get a 0.1, 0.2, that's typically what you might get in 30 minutes of fluoro time. You might get a 0.1 or 0.2. And then you get a 0.4 and you're like, oh, freaking out. Like that's just a terribly high number. And that's just, when you talk to the radiation safety, you're like, gosh, I mean, even if you got a millirem, you could still do 5,000 cases in a year at a millirem. But we're so used to seeing the 0.1s, 0.2 that you just have to be careful that you don't overtrain to some degree, because there are cases you might get a 1 on. But when you ask people, what were you getting before this? Most people have no idea, because they've never worn real-time dosimetry without a barrier protection. So you really have to put all that into context of what you were getting before relative to what you're getting now.
And for those of us that are either getting Rampart or already have it, are there any sort of rookie mistakes or common problems people experience in terms of not using it right or not setting it up right? Anything we can do to try to make, because we're getting it in a month or two, and I want to make sure that once we start, that we're doing it correctly, that we don't have some huge gap and I'm getting some massive dose of radiation, which I'm sure we'll catch on the badge. But any tips on that?
Well, and you can really see it before then. It's not, like I say, it's not rocket science. Now, I will say that using some of the either disposable or non-disposable soft shielding, we have a thing called a shadow, which you can just put wherever you need to, depending on what kind of case and your access site and all that. You can lay it across the patient. You can roll it up and put it up underneath the arm. There's, it's what we call a multi-purpose shield. You can kind of put it whatever, or you can use, rad pads or disposable shielding that you have as well. Most of the time, I think if you look that I never use many of those things, because it covers so well that you'll see that if it's not set up right after you've done 5 or 6 of them, when it's not set up right. And our teams are very, very good, because they're in there for a week with you, and they show you how to set it up. And once you do it, it's really not, it's not difficult. It's really just a massive head shield that you put into place, that soft shielding that comes down, which you have to be tentative of. And the rookie mistakes, I would say, is it's also very easy to raise it up, and we're used to raising our head shield or moving it out of the way and hitting the pedal. Well, this is your protection now. So you need to be sure before you hit that pedal, you bring it back down. If you're going to raise it up to do something with the access or whatever, most of the time you don't have to. Or if you want to slide it up to see something, then you might be tempted to raise it up or drop the table, and that'll create that little bit of a gap.
Got it.
But after you use it just a couple of times, it just kind of becomes second nature. I mean, I used it for 2.5 years before I went full time with Rampart, and even my team. To me, I kind of look at it like the pilot, co-pilot. That was a big thing with airlines, is the co-pilot should speak up if there's a problem and not be afraid to. I think that's one of the things that very important to train, that this is their protection as well. And they should have the right to speak up if it's not in the right position and say, lower this or raise this or do whatever they need to do, because that's their protection as well.
I love it. And then what's the capital expenditure for this, Bob, for folks that want to get it and want to talk to their administrators?
Yeah, I would say that, it ranges around the 180, 160 to 200 range, depending on what accessories that you get. I would say that's probably consistent with really everybody's advanced radiation protection. And the issue is the acrylic. The acrylic is just really, it's the most expensive shielding portion. All of the lead shielding is what really creates the expense of it. But I will say that our passion at Rampart, and I think most of the companies, is we want to get people out of lead. We want to protect people, and so as with most things, there's a lot of opportunities for discount multi-system deals and things like that. So I would say that they're being very, very creative. Most of the companies are being very, very creative on how do you afford this, and kind of meeting you where you are, meeting your hospital where they are, to try to make this happen. What we don't want is we don't want a class action. We don't want all of a sudden that the hospital say no and then everybody joins together and starts suing everybody. There hasn't been a technology until now, and so I think we do have to work with the hospitals and make sure that they're not going to be able to outfit every lab and every lab in the world in one day. It's gonna be a process, and to be honest, I don't think the companies could kind of keep up with it. I think it's going to take some time. I think people need to be patient, but on the other hand, I think certainly high volume operators, high volume rooms, complex cases, I think all those need to be outfitted now. And I think that and then you kind of again you move out from there, but we are seeing finally I think we're seeing the needle move, that people realize not only are they being educated about it, but you're seeing at all the society levels that now we're just about every meeting we go to has sessions on radiation protection, and that, we used to never have that. There was maybe one talk, and it was time distance shielding. It was the same old talk as ALARA. And, we got bored to tears with it, and so we quit listening, quit going to them. But now they're being, people are going and they're interested in them, and the fellows are getting educated on them. And like you say, I think that's one of the things the fellows need to do, is just say, what kind of radiation protection do you have? Because I'm not coming to have to put on my lead apron. And
when you're looking at fellowships, I think that should be, it's probably a selling point for some fellowships, is that
we've had quite a few, at the meetings, fellows will come up and go, where do you have them? Because that's where I'm not going to do my fellowship and put on and wear lead aprons. I want a hospital and a system that cares about me, and I'm going to the place that offers me the best radiation protection, because I'm worth it. And I think we are. We've invested a lot of time and energy, and we're kind of giving the world our talent, our gifts, and our sacrifices, and then to be taken out because of this is just not acceptable.
I totally agree. I give the millennials a lot of crap, but I think this is their time to raise the flag for this. That classic meme of the millennial interventional cardiologist versus the old school one. But you know what? One thing the millennials are very good at is being aware of radiation, and I think our generation could learn a lot from them in terms of this.
So. Joe, you'll love this. I was in a case with one of my newest partners, and I was, they were doing cases with me to do peripherals because they didn't get many peripherals in their practice, and they wanted to learn peripherals. And so we were in the middle of a case, and they were like, so we're at 2.5 gray on this case. Should we stop? And I just kind of looked at him like, we just crossed this lesion. You can't stop. I'm going to take this wire out now.
Why don't you just IVUS it again? We'll IVUS it again. We'll keep IVUSing it. So.
Yeah, I was like, there's no way. So, but yeah, they're much more cognizant about it. And rightly so, they should be, and we probably should have been too.
I love it. Well, Bob, that's about an hour, man. I'm really thankful to you for creating this technology and really getting it across our industry and our specialty for people like me that have really suffered from an illness or have acquired an illness from radiation or an occupational exposure. So I really thank you for all your work on this, and anything we can do to raise the flag on Murmur MD, we want to, because we care about our specialty, and we care about the future of our specialty, and we want us to thrive instead of languish with orthopedic injuries and cancer. So thank you so much. Any closing thoughts on your end, Bob? We had talked about don't wait until you have cancer or an occupational injury to think about this and really commit to it. Anything else that you'd want our listeners to know in terms of where the space is going?
No, I think the main thing is that just realize that you do have to have a voice. It's still going to be a while before it's going to happen for you. we still have to kind of get together and raise our flags. And certainly, if you already have injury or you're already having some issues, then make that aware, because it's you need to stop it if you can. And I would also say that encouraging people to go into our subspecialty, because I do think now we've got some options to protect you, and I think we're losing some really good talent out there, that not only through attrition and people leaving, but we're not recruiting like we should because of that fear. And I think now we've got ways of getting you through your whole career where you likelihood of having an injury or a cancer from radiation, I think, is going to be massively dropped, because we're protecting your whole body. And,
Totally.
and if you protect your whole body, then that's what's important, and just trying to get out of that lead.
Absolutely. No, we are so blessed to do this job. I don't think there's any other specialty, in my biased opinion, that makes more of an impact on people's lives than what we do. And that's the paradox is, we make the biggest impact, but we also take the greatest danger. And so I think if we can mitigate that and continue to make an impact on people's lives without suffering ourselves, I think that's the most important thing. So thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, if anybody wants to inquire about Rampart, where's the best place to go?
Yeah, just go rampartic.com and you can just put in a request. We'll reach back out to you. We have our teams are just very good at teaching and instructing, and most of them are out of the lab. And I think that's one of the things is we really partner. We're not just about just one product. It's really a whole list of products that we kind of meet you where we are. We see what kind of procedures you're doing, how many people in the room, and try to outfit them all so that we can get them out of lead.
Yeah, I've been really impressed with your team so far. Jeff's been great, and everyone we worked with. So thanks again, Bob. You have a great day, and thanks for spending your Monday afternoon with me. All right.
Appreciate it. Thanks.